This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. Beginning today's show is part of a Fins, Fur, and Feathers podcast by Drew Ricketts and Joe Gerken at K-State. They talk about squirrels, what they can get into, and how people can help exclude them from areas. Chip Redmond, K-State meteorologist, continues the show with a segment discussing weather myths and if there's any truth to them. K-State dairy specialist Mike Brouk ends today's show, providing an update on HPAI in dairy cattle, and he reminds producers to remain vigilant in their biosecurity measures to control spread and impact on the dairy industry. That and more is coming up ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our show with part of a Fins, Fur, and Feathers podcast episode from K-State's Drew Ricketts and Joe Gerken.
Drew, I think you're going to talk to us about some critters that live in trees today, huh?
Yeah. I thought today was one of those days when I went and looked at our website and tried to decide what was going to be popular right now, and tree squirrels is the species page that's getting the most hits right now. So yeah. And squirrels are one of those critters where we can talk about, the benefits of the species, talk about the biology, but they're also a critter that causes lots of people a lot of problems. So it makes it good.
I wouldn't necessarily think about the problems per se, but when you say a tree squirrel, I've had people say, is that just a regular squirrel? So why don't you start out by telling us what is a tree squirrel?
Yeah. Most of the time when people think about squirrels, they're probably thinking about tree squirrels, but we've got a lot of ground squirrels in Kansas. If we think about all the different squirrel species, prairie dogs would be one that people wouldn't necessarily think of as being squirrels. We've also got a couple of different species that folks would call ground squirrels, groundhogs or woodchucks. They're a ground squirrel. Chipmunks. So those are all squirrel species that we don't necessarily think about as squirrels all the time. But the tree squirrels, so thinking about fox squirrels, eastern gray squirrels, and southern flying squirrels are the main tree squirrel species that we have in the state.
Are they eating acorns?
So all of our squirrel species are going to eat lots of nuts, other tree fruits. They eat some fungus and things like that. They're also going to eat lots of seeds. Sometimes they'll eat bark off of trees. They'll eat green growing shoots of other vegetation. The bark is something that they mainly eat if it's like really dry and they're having a hard time finding other stuff to eat. They'll also eat some insect matter. They'll eat some bird eggs sometimes, even some mice and voles too.
You see them running along the ground. Do they ever live on the ground, or are they only going to live in trees?
No, they'll spend quite a bit of time on ground, but they do need to be able to have a nest, either in a cavity or a leaf nest that they make up in a tree. Because they're pretty susceptible to predation if they're on the ground. They don't live in holes in the ground or anything like that. So you'll only find them where there's tree cover.
There is a season for squirrels in Kansas, right?
Yeah. Squirrels used to be a really popular game animal. A lot of people used to hunt squirrels. I mean, back when I was growing up hunting in the 90s, squirrels were a species that we hunted quite a bit. I don't know. I think we've sort of transitioned into a lot of people wanting just to hunt the big sexy species like white-tailed deer and waterfowl and that sort of thing. But I enjoy harvesting squirrels and eating squirrel every once in a while. The hunting season's sort of designed to protect that main time frame when they're reproducing. So in Kansas, we've got our hunting season runs from June 1st until the end of February. And we've got, I think, a 5 squirrel per day limit, but the possession limit's pretty high. It's 20 or 30.
Yeah.
We don't hunt southern flying squirrels, so just hunt fox squirrels and gray squirrels in Kansas.
What other type of damage might they do?
Well, along with the tree side of things, when we get in those real droughty periods, when they get to eating bark, sometimes they'll get like really high up in an oak tree or a hackberry tree or something like that, and they'll actually girdle that main center trunk up high. They cause folks a lot of problems in gardens. They like to dig up newly planted plantings. I mean, a lot of times it doesn't matter what we've got where we've planted, but even in planters like pots and things like that, sometimes we just put some new potting soil in there and they just get to digging. And they'll dig up plants when they're doing that. Sometimes they're eating those green shoots like we talked about. Sometimes they will actually dig up newly planted bulbs and eat those and things. So they can cause folks problems in gardens that way. They also will eat vegetables. And those are more like, it's property damage and it's frustrating, but those sorts of things don't tend to cause like catastrophic problems. But squirrels do like to get into attics. If they can get in through a large open vent, or if there's some rotting wood or something like that under a soffit that they can chew into, then they'll get into an attic and they will live in there. And squirrels, as rodents, like to chew on things. Other things, they will get underneath the car hood sometimes and build a nest. And when they do that, they chew on all kinds of things. And again, wiring is one of those things that they chew on. So.
Are there things we can do to keep them out of our attic or other spaces?
Yeah, so, if we think about that acronym, HER, Habitat Modification, Exclusion, and Removal, if you're thinking about keeping them out of an attic, exclusion's the best way there. And finding any access points and either repairing them so that they can't chew back through. If you've got some soft wood on a house, covering that up with flashing or going ahead and repairing it, covering up any vents that might be big enough that a squirrel could get through. Most of them are going to have louvers on them that would exclude squirrels, but if they don't, get some really heavy-duty screen or hardware cloth or something like that behind them. It can be really hard to keep them out of vehicles. Parking a vehicle in a closed garage is the best way to keep them out, and aside from that, it can be pretty tough sometimes. The other kinds of damage that they cause, exclusion is beneficial there too. One of the really good ways to keep them from digging in pots where we've got plants planted, or to keep them from digging up newly planted bulbs, is like after we plant things, then we can put chicken wire just above where we've planted those bulbs, and then we can go ahead and cover that with soil. If we've got potted plants, you can do a couple of different things. Right when you plant them, you could put hardware cloth down in there to where you can't see it, cover that up with a little bit of soil. They would still be able to chew off the new growth above that, but it keeps them from digging so much. You can also use chicken wire too, and just put chicken wire over the top of the pot, and that gap between the chicken wire and the soil in the pot keeps them from being able to dig down in there and get stuff. Removing food is a really good way to stop a lot of squirrel problems. Many of the people that I work with that are having squirrel issues are feeding birds. And squirrels don't know that the reason that you put that food out there is for birds. And they're going to eat that food, and that's also going to bring more squirrels probably into the yard, and they may cause more problems. So, removing a bird feeder is an appropriate way to try and reduce squirrel damage if we've got a lot of squirrel damage. Other ways to think about habitat modification and squirrels: if you're planting trees in a yard and you don't want to have problems with squirrels, then planting trees that are not going to produce nuts or not going to produce fruit. Some other habitat modification that we can do to try and limit their use of bird feeders: if we have our bird feeder like hanging from a metal shepherd's crook or something like that they can't climb up, we can also put some flashing pointed downwards away from a pole that a bird feeder is hung from to prevent them. And then finally, sometimes folks will put their bird feeders on like a pulley system that's out away from the trunk of a tree where a squirrel may have a hard time getting to it. But understanding that all of those feeder designs, if we have feed that spills on the ground, then squirrels are still going to use that.
Sure. What about removal? Are there squirrel traps?
Yep, there absolutely are. And there's cage designs. There are also lethal squirrel traps that can be very effective. There's one that I've got a CO2 powered lethal squirrel trap that's pretty new on the market that I bought to try out. I haven't tried it out yet to see how well it works, but that would be a humane method of euthanasia. It cervically dislocates them and then it resets, and you could remove a lot of squirrels that way. But understand that because this is a harvested species and we've got a season for it, that removal's going to be one of those sort of last ditch things that we probably want to do. And any trapping or removal efforts are going to have to fit within the statutes and regulations that we have for the town that we live in if we live inside of a municipality as well. Squirrels are a species that a lot of folks want to trap and move if they're having problems, and I just want to remind folks we do have an episode about wildlife translocation or moving problem critters. There was a study that found that after 3 weeks, the translocated squirrels that they moved from a park in town to a nice hardwood forest, it's like 97% of them were either gone or dead after 3 weeks.
You know, growing up, I was always taught you see squirrels dig and plant walnuts all over the place.
Yeah.
And I guess I got 2 questions with that. Are they digging those up later to eat them? And is that really helping get more walnut trees to grow in an area?
Yeah, I think both of those things are probably true. What squirrels like to cache their food, and different kinds of squirrels do that differently. A lot of the ground squirrels create what we call middens. Yep. And so that's like where they've collected a whole bunch of nuts or seeds or something and put it in one spot. Whereas fox squirrels, eastern gray squirrels tend to be more of a hoarder is what we would call it, but they create their cache and it's spread all over the place, and they've got an incredible spatial memory. And they're not trying to plant trees. Their goal is to save food for later, for harder times. But when they do that, there are some of those that they don't go back and find, and those do sprout and grow into trees sometimes.
Once again, that was K-State's Drew Ricketts and Joe Gerken. You can hear the full podcast episode by following the link in today's show notes on agtoday.net or by searching for Fins, Fur, and Feathers on your favorite podcast platform. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but stick around because we have more for you after the break.
You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our show on April 1st, also commonly referred to as April Fool's Day, to talk about some weather myths and facts, and then to tell us if they're true or not, we have K-State meteorologist Chip Redmond. Chip, thanks for joining us today.
They're all myths, I can tell you that right now.
So Chip, as we're talking about this, does someone control the weather?
Well, I think someone somewhere controls the weather. Mother Nature, it really has the main hand, though. When we look at the climate as a whole and the globe, everything's driven by the sun, right? If we don't have the sun, we can't have our patterns, and we can't have our temperature differentials that drive our big storm systems. We wouldn't have our seasons either. And if we take away that sun, then we wouldn't have anything. We'd be kind of like Mars, where the weather's the same all the time. So if we consider the things that humans do, humans like to build things, humans like to put in cities, those have an impact on the local climate. They warm that climate locally because they absorb more of that sun, and you're going to get different reactions from the atmosphere as a result. And we see that in Atlanta, some of the southeast cities in the summertime, when they just need a little bit of moisture. And they already had that heat source from the sun, and that develops thunderstorms in and around the city. So I will say that, again, Mother Nature drives it. We live in Kansas. If we didn't have the Gulf of moisture to our south, we would be a very dry climate. But we are able to get that Gulf of moisture northward. And the reason we're able to do that is because of the Rocky Mountains. And the Rocky Mountains allow those storm systems that move from west to east to come over those mountains, develop that strong southerly flow in advance of them, bring that moisture up, and create a storm system. Typically, when you're on the lee side of the mountain range, like you look at the deserts in the western U.S., they are on the lee side of mountains, and they don't have a body of water to supply that region with precipitation, with moisture. And so they're in a desert. So we are in Kansas, especially, a very unique place where Mother Nature drives the weather, and people not so much. There's a couple of different myths out there. One of them is wind turbines and that they affect the weather. And we've got a lot of wind turbines in Kansas. There's been a lot of research on them. They found in a tropical storm there was like a 0.1% reduction of precipitation downstream of those wind turbines because it created more mixing, supposedly. That's such a small amount. We think about other contributing factors of humans like irrigation. Like irrigation literally puts water on the surface, which then evaporates into the atmosphere, which manipulates the atmosphere. So humans are manipulating the atmosphere. We're almost putting more moisture in than we could ever take out from any wind turbines. And so I think that has had a big role in manipulating the climate in Kansas. And then we look at other crops like corn. It has a very high evapotranspiration rate. It transpires so much moisture. That's actually influenced long-term dew point trends and moisture trends in the center of the U.S. because of that. And it's hotter, even though the temperatures aren't hotter, because guess what? We have more moisture and it feels hotter than what it really is.
And a lot of these things are things you've heard as you've talked about the weather with other people. And the next one, something that happens on February 2nd, Groundhog Day. Does the groundhog do anything, Chip?
Animals are smart creatures. We don't take advantage of their intelligence, I think, sometimes. Groundhog Day, besides the movie, which is, a decent movie, Groundhog's Day is one of those that I struggle with. The groundhog doesn't know anything about the weather. He's being pulled out of his den or his house or whatever people put him in. It doesn't mean anything. I think, what was it? Long Island Chuck is the groundhog in Long Island. And he has an 80% accuracy rate, but he's the only one that's that close. So I'm not going to make any guesstimations of what they're doing with Long Island Chuck in the background to make him that accurate, but that's exceedingly high compared to all the other groundhogs. And groundhogs have no idea what's going to happen in the future. And we humans are much more intelligent than groundhogs, and we still don't understand sometimes what's going to happen in the future. There's a lot of other animals that have myths around them. Probably one of the most famous ones is the woolly bear worm or woolly worm, or basically the caterpillar stage of the tiger moth. And it's typically in the fall when you look at that band and how big that black band is decides how rough winter will be. Well, they have literal festivals like out east. I'm from Ohio originally, and they have the Woolly Bear Festival that they measure all these bands, and they're not accurate at all. But they try to make it fun, right? You got to make it kind of accurate. There's actually 2 typical generations of woolly bear worms every year. There's one in the spring because they hibernate over the winter. They actually freeze and then they unfreeze. I wouldn't mind having that skill set myself. But as they unfreeze in the summer, that's that round that becomes tiger moth.
Is there a generation of them that is correct?
Yeah, well, typically the fall ones have to be right because they are the ones right before winter. But it really depends on what kind of food they eat and their habitat and how they survive and blend in. So they don't really have a good play on what the winter will be. Common right now is looking at like turtles and snakes and the direction of travel. Are they crossing roads? Are they going from east to west from the road? Because if they go east to west, they're moving to higher ground so that they don't get washed out during heavy rain. And again, most snakes hang out on roads in the middle of the afternoon because they want to be warm. And so not really a good delineator, but it is kind of fun to get excited. And that's really what a lot of these are, right? They're reasons for folks to get excited for the weather change. And when we look at things like atmospheric phenomenon, like fog is a great example where, we typically have fog in the wintertime because temperature's cooler, it's easier for us to reach a dew point. And then guess what happens 90 days later from a fog? Springtime. And typically in the springtime, we have moisture. So you can't ever tie that to a fog. Like last year is a great example. In 2024, we had about 10 straight days of just heavy fog throughout the Central Plains. And 9 days later, we actually were below normal precipitation through April and May. So again, no real linkage. But there is a little bit of reference to things like the red sky at night, sailors delight. Red sky at morning, sailors take warning. So when you have a red sky at night, you have to have the sun reaching the bottom of the clouds, those high clouds. And when you have a departing storm system, there's usually cirrus in the wake of that storm. And since the sun can hit it, there's nothing blocking that sun, which means clear skies to the west, which means typically higher pressure building in. And then in the morning, when we have that cirrus moving in, it moves in typically in advance of a storm system or in advance of a warm front. The sun is clear to the east, and the rays can reach the underside of that cloud cover from the east because there are high pressures to the east, and that high pressure is moving away, which means the storm system is moving in later that day potentially. So there is a little bit of factual information that's tied to those. And that's why people have started believing them over a long period of time.
And as we're thinking about things potentially happening with storms, lightning, can people actually get hit by lightning if they're showering during a storm?
Yeah, so lightning's one of those things that it's just flat out dangerous. We know don't be under a tree. Your body conducts electricity easier than the wood does. So a tree will leave the wood and go to you. Don't go near a fence line because fences can allow for the electricity to travel long distances. This is why they have electric fences, right? Don't shower and take a bath during a thunderstorm because guess what? Water and pipes are also great conductors of electricity. So if you are running water, especially in like a shower might be a little harder just because you have the discontinuity of the shower head typically, but electricity can still travel through it and it can go long distances. Now we've kind of transitioned towards different kinds of piping, right? Like PVC. That's obviously not as conducive to electricity, but that water's still hyperconductive and very easy for electricity to travel. So also not a good idea to take a shower or a bath. Just like the old days, don't talk on the telephone because it can hit that telephone line and go long distances.
And as we round out our segment for today, Chip, what about crickets? What's the theory around crickets?
So crickets are another one of those animals that their movement can be reflected based upon the temperature. And so they tend to chirp slower in cold temperatures. That's why in the fall, when you have that lingering cricket around, you can hear that gradual crick, crick, crick. This is a long period. Where in the summertime, they're a lot faster. And there is a correlation there of temperature. So they tend to make their noise faster with warmer temperatures. So supposedly, and I could probably get corrected by some folks here at K-State, supposedly if you listen to them for 14 seconds and you count the number of chirps that it does, and then you add 40 in Fahrenheit, that's the temperature it is. So, crickets and other animals, they live in the world environment like cows. They can sit down when it rains, but they can also stand up. So you can't really use it, but they still know that change is coming. And we think about aches and pains like people have, like the pressure changes with the storm system. And so the density of all the air on us from in the atmosphere adjusts, and the critters can adjust and know in advance. They've been around just as long as we have, and they have understood the processes. And so there's a lot of folklore out there, but there's some facts blended in, and we need to just make sure that this April Fool's Day, make sure that we stick to the facts of weather and be optimistic about what's going to come in the future.
Chip, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today and hopefully adding some humor to the day for people.
Thank you.
That was K-State meteorologist Chip Redmond. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but we'll be right back.
This is Agriculture Today. Along with Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. We end today's program with this week's milk lines. HPAI, or bird flu, in U.S. dairy cattle has been weakening since it was first detected in March 2024. However, HPAI is still being detected in some states. K-State dairy specialist Mike Brouk reminds producers to remain vigilant in their biosecurity measures to control its spread and mitigate the impact on the dairy industry.
Today I'd like to visit with our Kansas dairy producers concerning the influence of bird flu, or HPAI, on our dairy herds across the United States as well as here in Kansas. Many of you are probably very aware of what's going on in the grocery store when it comes to egg prices and the poultry industry. Obviously, the poultry industry has been hit much harder by bird flu than we have been in the dairy industry, but it is influencing our industry as well. Currently, in the last 30 days, there have been 19 new detections in 4 different states: California, Idaho, Nevada, and Arizona. Interesting thing about a couple of these cases is it was a transfer from wild birds to dairy cows. Many of our infections across the United States have actually been associated with the movement of dairy cows from an infected herd to a non-infected herd. However, most recently, this has not been the case. Since we started having problems with HPAI and it was detected in dairy herds about 16 months ago, we've had about 983 herds infected across 17 states. Here in Kansas, our last infected herd was actually detected April 17th of 2024. So we've been almost a year now without a new infected herd in our state. I think most of you are probably also aware that we do have a milk monitoring system that is responsible for getting regular samples from silos of milk at dairy processing plants to determine if that raw milk is carrying HPAI. This is occurring across much of the United States and actually has helped us detect HPAI in some of the dairy herds that have been more recently detected. And some changes are occurring in how this impacts our dairy herds. When HPAI was first discovered in dairy animals, we were experiencing some severe reactions from these animals. So when we think about the more recent cases, they have not been exhibiting the same types of symptoms. In several cases, these animals actually were non-symptomatic. However, they were shedding HPAI in their milk, and that was detected with the milk monitoring system. So as we think about a typical virus generally does change over time, and it actually does become weaker. So we might expect that we would have less of a symptomatic response from our dairy animals as we move forward and as this virus continues to grow weaker over time. So you need to still be vigilant in your efforts to make sure that you're practicing good biosecurity on your dairy farm. If you are receiving animals from other places onto your dairy farm, whether it be replacement animals or calves, bulls, whatever it might be, make sure that those animals are coming from herds that are not exhibiting symptoms for HPAI or herds that are currently positive for HPAI. As we maintain our vigilant attempt to try to maintain our biosecurity programs, hopefully we will be able to prevent any new infections here in the state of Kansas. And keep in mind that our poultry industry is much more affected than we are, and there have been traces of the disease spreading from a dairy herd to poultry operations. In our poultry operations, the animals actually do die or will have to be destroyed. And as we look at what's happened since the first of 2024 across the United States in the poultry industry, over 54 million birds have had to be destroyed due to infection with HPAI. So for our poultry friends, it continues to be a very, very serious situation. And for us in the dairy industry, we need to maintain our vigilance to prevent the spread as much as possible. This is Mike Brouk with K-State Research and Extension, encouraging our dairy farms to make sure they're practicing biosecurity to help limit the spread of HPAI within our dairy herds.
Thanks, Mike. And that'll do it for this edition of Agriculture Today. For Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. This is the K-State Radio Network.